Us, as usual, I'm joined by my co-pilot, Pete O'Rourke, our footy insider, who's always got his finger on the pulse. How are you, Pete?
Yeah, I'm good, Tony. Thank you. Not too bad. Obviously, international break last week, so there wasn't as much news going around, but always stuff going on. And as we said, PSR, FFP still dominating the headlines as well. But yeah, I hear you were in Georgia for the week as well, so good timing being over there for the delights of them qualifying for this summer's Euros, which must have been a great event to be at.
Yeah, I timed it really well. I mean, obviously, international break, it was this new format of the playoffs that is sort of, I don't know how it's come to be, but they had a game against Luxembourg, which they won 2-0. And by the way, Luxembourg, I think they've got a few ringers in there, just between me and you. I think there's a few Portuguese lads who've been nationalised. They're not a bad side. So they won that 2-0 on the first game, and that sort of had a playoff, that set up a playoff. Also, it was the first one was in Tbilisi, at Dinamo Tbilisi Stadium, big stadium. Second one was against Greece, again in Dinamo Tbilisi Stadium. So they had two home games, and Greece aren't a bad side. You know, there's a couple of really good players on the Greek side. Anyway, that went classically with an Englishman there, extra time and penalties. And Georgia got through on penalties, which prompted pitch invasion and mayhem and scenes in the city centre that were fantastic. You know, the first ever Euros major tournament they've ever qualified for. So that's booked my ticket to Germany anyway. Pete, are you going to Germany?
Sort of, not as yet, mate. I'm hoping to see if there's any late deals I can get out there, but yeah, looking unlikely. The missus is trying to get me booked on holiday, so I might have to watch it somewhere else, unfortunately, in that respect. But yeah, as I said, great to see these new teams qualifying for the Euros, and as I said, Georgia, all those years of hard work and maybe some disappointing results, it's all worth it now. Now they've got to the finals, and we look forward to seeing them reaching the finals in Germany, and obviously disappointment for Wales when you're looking for their home nation not qualifying, losing in the penalty shootout. But yeah, still got England and Scotland there as well, so should be a great tournament, and looking forward to it once we get this domestic season over at the end of this season.
And Scotland have obviously got the opening game, I think, against Germany, isn't it? Which is, you know, that's a nice showpiece for Scotland.
Yeah, massive opportunity for Scotland to really announce themselves on that opening game against Germany. All the pressure will be on Germany, obviously, being the host nation and everything, but they've not been having a great time of it of late. So Steve Clarke and the Scotland boys might fancy causing a bit of an upset there.
I think so. I think so, Pete. But listen, let's get on to business of today. We've got a really special guest. We don't very often have people with letters in front of the name. And you've probably got letters after your name, Dan, haven't you?
Yeah, doing a bit of a collection on them.
You what? You've made
doing a bit of a collection on them, yeah.
So we're joined by Dan Plumley. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, Dan, just for the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Thanks, Pete. Delighted to be on. So, yeah, I'm an academic by trade. Teach sport finance at Sheffield Hallam University. Studied for a PhD in sport finance a few years ago, which is still one of the few sport finance PhDs in the field. That led to a research kind of career that spans financial performance analysis of professional football teams, for the most part, but I've done work in rugby union, cricket, and a few other sports as well. Some stuff around kind of the broader sport economics structure and league design, competitive balance, impact of regulatory frameworks, as I'm sure we'll get onto today. And for my sins, also a qualified chartered global management accountant. So yeah, nice little rounded portfolio, and have been able to use some of that research to get involved with the industry and obviously people like yourselves and some of the media work that I do. So yeah, nice little plenty of stuff to keep me busy, and especially at this time and at this moment.
I bet when you started all that study, you never believed that it could be so high on the agenda as it is. You know, it was almost a golden ticket. You know, you probably didn't know, however many years ago you started, that this was going to be flavor of the month or flavor of the year, or even longer than that.
Absolutely not. You have those moments of reflection, don't you? And I'm sort of 10 years or so into that career now, and at the time, it was topical to a degree, but certainly nowhere near on the level that it is today. So yeah, fortunate in many respects to have been able to carve a career out of that. But fully enjoy it, and the work is brilliant. And I was a failed footballer way back in the day, so at least
join the club, Pete. Pete, have you got your hand up?
Yeah, at least I've been able to stay in the game at some.
How far did you get, Dan, with your footballing? Did you play?
No, it was never the levels of getting close. I had a few trials at various clubs in and around the region in my early days, but a good county standard was about as far as I was ever going to get.
And who's your team, Dan?
I'm from the blue side of Sheffield for my sins again. I'm a Sheffield Wednesday fan, and I'll blame my dad for that. So had no choice.
Yeah, Sheffield Wednesday now. I don't think they're going to feature in this episode either, but they've got an owner.
I'll take that, Tony. I'll take that. Let's stay away from them today.
Let's stay away. I'm sure there's other clubs, Pete, that we can talk about. Dan, just give us the overview of, profit and sustainability rules, and just start from the beginning, really. Not everyone on this call will know the sort of background and how they came into being. So just paint a picture for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned my career started sort of 10 years ago in this space. It was around a similar time that UEFA were looking at implementing what has now become known as financial fair play in the early 2010s. That first set of regulatory framework went through 2011. And that was around essentially a reaction to a lot of overspending across the European game, not just English football, but this kind of notion that what we were seeing in the numbers was clubs overspending, certainly spending more than they generate in revenue on wages in particular, but running up significant losses. And those regulations were designed to stop that in essence. And what with the first construct of that was a break-even requirement, essentially, which meant that your revenue and losses were at very least equal in principle, but they did allow for this thing called an acceptable loss, which was set forward on a cumulative 3-year cycle to measure the losses.
And this was UEFA that started this, Dan?
It was UEFA that started it, yes. And that figure originally was set at 35 million euros for any club that wanted to compete or did compete in UEFA's competitions at the time. Now, what some of the national leagues then did domestically was to react to those regulations, and the Premier League did this, was to move to their own set of regulatory framework that broadly mirrored UEFA's, but was slightly different in parts due to the nuance of individual leagues. And if you look at the Premier League profit and sustainability regulations that we're talking about right now, they had the break-even principle in there, but their acceptable loss figure was set at £105 million, so far greater than UEFA's. And that, around the time, that was down to the fact that in many ways that's linked to the gap between the Premier League and the Championship, because what they were doing there to a degree was to say, well, Championship clubs need to be able to spend to compete when they come up, or at least try to. So we need to have the bar a little bit higher because they need
right. I wondered how that figure had come about. It wasn't just a random plucked out. There were, because obviously if you get into the Premier League, if you win the Championship playoff, for example, you already have 100 million better income
at least,
next season. That's about, so 105 is where they're settled at.
Yeah, there's still some kind of, and we'll never know how they arrived at that absolute figure. But I think the other interesting thing there to note, just before we probably get into some of the finer details on the numbers, is the clubs themselves actually signed up to these agreements. So again, it's kind of often forgotten about that actually the way this works is the clubs agree to these changes, and those changes are then implemented. So however the negotiations went all those years ago, and the Premier League's version of what is now PSR actually came about very soon after UEFA's version of FFP in the first instance. Right. So we are going back, 10, 12 years or so now, but it was the clubs that signed up to that, and that figure was agreed by the collective clubs at the time.
And there was a couple of figures you mentioned there, that 35 million in UEFA terms, and then 105 in the Premier League terms. That's one or two players.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we roll that through and we bring in the Championship clubs as well, they also, the Football League, but just in the Championship, also had a similar version of profit and sustainability, and that figure was set at a cumulative £39 million over 3 years. So one of the things that I've always kind of said in this regard, and you have some degree of sympathy in some cases here, is you effectively have clubs that could move between all three of those competitions in theory. Happened to Wolves as an example, and they were fined by UEFA because they got promoted out of the Championship into the Premier League and then straight into Europe. And all the while you have different levels of financial frameworks that you are trying to budget against.
It's a great example, that Wolves one, isn't it, Pete? Because, you know, George Mendes arrives in Wolves working with the new ownership of the club, starts to bring some top-class Portuguese players, win the league or get up. I can't remember whether they won the league or they got up in second or playoff, but I think got up, but then fell foul. You could understand it, why they fell foul of UEFA's rules, but then how, you know, the Premier League, how do they sit together?
Well, obviously, we know Tony Wolves had a really meteoric rise once George Mendes got involved, bringing over some top players from Portugal, the likes of Ruben Neves, Diogo Jota as well. Obviously, rose through from the Championship, won that, and then obviously went into the Premier League and finished, I think, 7th in the first season. So, unbelievable success. But now, on the flip side of that, they're starting to feel the effects of that. Folks and the owners obviously restricted the budget in the summer transfer window, and that led to Julian Lopetegui walking out in Wolves basically and saying they wouldn't be able to compete. Gary O'Neill took up the reins, and for me, probably arguably in contention for manager of the year for what he's done at Wolves, to have them safe from any relegation fight, even outside chance of qualifying for Europe. But then even he's now sort of bemoaning the fact that the club have had to sort of tighten the purse strings in the last couple of transfer windows and spend within their means because of where they have found themselves financially over the last previous 3 seasons under when George Mendes was heavily involved at the club as well. So obviously you can have your highs, but then it can end up in lows as well. And we know Wolves were very close on FFP in the summer transfer window.
Right. And look, Dan, we've had, well, let's get into the particular cases and the particular clubs, because, you know, we talked about on the last episode, and we were basically, me and Pete were looking at the relegation struggles in the Premier League, and 2 of those clubs, namely Everton and Nottingham Forest, have fallen foul. Just talk to us about those particular clubs, and then we'll get on to, you know, some of the other issues as well.
Yeah, I think those 2 are kind of front and center of dominating the conversation at the minute. And I just think wider, to build on Pete's point there, it is really important, because the reality of this situation, and Everton and Forest are 2 good examples, is, you know, you'll never hear me certainly say, with, you know, from the accountant side of things, if I put that hat on for a minute, that overspending is a good thing. And there's been some real, you know, financial management challenges at those clubs. But the reality of it is that they think they have to do that to try and even get close to getting into that top 6 or 7. And, you know, if you can do it once, it's phenomenal. If you can repeat the trick, then even better. But a lot of clubs can't. And I suppose Leicester are another good example of that. But yeah, I think the situation at Everton and Forest, they are 2 different cases, despite the way they're playing out with points deductions. The Everton situation involves a lot of complexity around the takeover of the club, the stadium, the way in which the stadium was financed, and how that impacts the PSR calculations, the wider scope of what they've been trying to do with that club. And if you roll that back to some 3-5 years ago, some of the strategy documentation from the clubs themselves, and Moshiri was very bullish about this, that they were aiming to be an established top 8 Premier League club. And you know, on reflection, that was almost an impossible task in itself, but the whole budget and financial management was kind of working towards that. So they've breached Premier League profit and sustainability regulations for a first time. There's a second charge pending. We've seen the way the first charge has played out with the points deduction. I'd be surprised if there's not a second points deduction coming for Everton.
Really?
They've just posted. I mean, they've just filed their accounts for the 2022-23 season, as a lot of clubs have been doing over the weekend. Anybody that's been kind of on and around that on social media will have seen a flurry of activity of numbers. But they've just made an £89.1 million loss in the most recent set of accounts. Their pre-tax losses in the last 5 years are over £500 million. It doesn't really, you know, you're all shaking your head at those numbers. The numbers are crazy.
I didn't realize. Yeah, I didn't realize that. You know, this second charge, because obviously it was 10 points reduced to 6.
Yeah,
on the second charge that's pending is the. I mean, I just think, Pete, if you're trying to transform the club, apparently the people who've seen that stadium that's going up on the docks in Liverpool, it's a fantastic stadium apparently. But Pete, surely the financials, you're trying to transform a club. Obviously, if you're building infrastructure, surely that must have some bearing on all this.
Yeah, it will have some bearing on it, Tony. But again, Everton have been using the move to the new stadium in Brownlee Dock as one of the reasons why they've recorded these massive losses. But to be fair, it's the sixth successive season that Everton have recorded losses. I think last season their loss was 44.7 million deficit.
Yeah.
And now this year it's double. That's 89.1, and that's even including the trading of players like Anthony Gordon, who went to Newcastle for 45 plus million. So,
and that's looking like a good investment from Newcastle.
Yeah, well, that's how other clubs will be looking at clubs struggling financially and be able to try and lure away their best players and maybe get them for a cut price deal. That's why there's been lots of talk that June 30th this year could be the unofficial transfer deadline day, because a lot of clubs will be looking to balance their books before they obviously do their accounts for the end of year as well. So you got a lot of clubs who will be nervously waiting for June 30th when they can publish their accounts.
And that was another thing, maybe, I don't know, Pete or Dan, that if you sell a good player out of your academy that's come up through your academy, like the Anthony Gordons of this world, on the balance sheet, that's like accountants must be rubbing their hands when they see Anthony Gordon going to Newcastle because of what it does for the balance sheet. Just talk to us a little bit about that, because I sort of get it, but I'm from a football point of view, if you're born and bred on Merseyside, I don't know whether Anthony Gordon's a Liverpool, Everton fan. I don't know. Do you know, Pete? But
he played for Liverpool as a kid, but then he went to Everton, so I think he's definitely a blue.
He's definitely blue. Well, he's a Newcastle player now, so he's obviously kissing the Newcastle badge. But that's a different issue. But that issue, just talk to us about that. Pete or Dan. I don't know who wants to take it.
Yeah, I mean it's the way, without getting overly technical, but people will have heard this term of amortization, and it's to do with the way basically that player transfers are recorded on the balance sheet. And what happens is when a player is transferred, the club will divide the transfer fee by the length of the contract, and that is the figure that sits on the balance sheet. So there's an amortized cost per year.
Yeah.
To roll that through, Tony, against the examples that you're talking about, that's where we've seen a lot of clubs looking to sell homegrown players because they have never had a book value on the accounts because they've come through the academy and you've never paid a transfer fee. So people will have heard this term pure profit in sale terms, which basically means when you sell one of those players, they have no book value. So it's all profit that can then go against the bottom line calculation. And we've seen, Chelsea are another example where people have talked about, and Pete mentioned June the 30th being like this new transfer deadline day, which is, I think we will see a bit of that moving forward. But, talk about Conor Gallagher in the summer. They sold Mason Mount to Manchester United last summer. It's those kind of transfers that for the club are pure profit. So whatever the fee is, that's the figure you can record on the accounts.
So it's beneficial to sell somebody who's come up through the academy. It's simple as that, really.
It's not the best way to look at it from the player side of things, but the financial reality of the industry at the minute is exactly that. Yeah.
And let's talk about Forest now, because Pete, Forest, when they came up, they didn't half splash I think they had like 50 new players or something. Not 50. I think it's like exaggeration from me.
It's around 40 over the last couple of transfer windows. I think
40. Oh, it wasn't so bad as an exaggeration.
But yeah, Forest will argue that they needed those changes coming into the Premier League after being so many years outside the top flight. If they wanted to be competitive, they had to bring in new faces, obviously increase the wage bill as a result of that as well. And as I said, it's hard to be competitive in the Premier League now, especially when you do come off of the Championship. And we've seen that already this season with the clubs that have come up. They're all fighting relegation battles this year, and it just shows the gap is getting bigger between the rich and powerful clubs and those other clubs in the Premier League as well. So for Forest, I have a bit of sympathy for them. Obviously, probably wasn't the best planning to go out and sign so many players and spend so much money in the last few transfer windows that they've been in the Premier League. But yeah, they've been handed this 4-point deduction. The thing that surprised me, Dan, was they've actually appealed it. I was surprised about it, especially when in that the verdict, the Premier League actually commended Forest for cooperating with him and everything else, and they took 2 points off the initial charge of 6 points to give them 4. So have they had some positive news that they think they can get more points back on this appeal?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? And I think just to tag on to that as well, before we try and answer that question, the other difference with the Forest case is that the number is different that we're aiming at, because some of their financial information relates to seasons when they were in the Championship. So their acceptable loss figure was actually £61 million. And that kind of aligns to Pete's point there, not just about having to spend to compete in the Premier League, but actually when you do go up, you need to be careful of where you were against the Championship regulations versus the Premier League regulations. So that's interesting as well as a difference to the Everton case. But yeah, I think in terms of the question, Pete, around the appeal, I just think at the minute, because, and I hate using this word, I've used it so a lot recently, but because we're in unprecedented circumstances with, you know, this whole thing, it's the first time we've seen clubs deducted points, even though the regulations have been there since the early 2010s.
Yeah.
I think clubs are just going, well, do you know what? We might as well appeal. Like, what have we got to lose by appealing? We've put our case forward, as you said. We've cooperated with the Premier League in the case of Forest. They've given us a couple of points back for mitigation in that regard. But because of the Everton situation, because of everything else that's up in the air, if you know, we might as well just appeal. And you know, that does come with a cost. There's cost to doing that. But if you think you've got even half a chance, I mean, looking at the table and the clubs that are in the mix, we could be talking 1 point could be the difference. And financially, that's the difference between, as Tony was saying earlier, the £100 million minimum TV money in the Premier League versus a first year parachute payment is about £60 million. So that 1 point could mean £60 million. And I think then clubs go, well, you know what, we might as well just appeal. Let's see.
Yes, but if the Premier League sort of suggests that it's a frivolous appeal, there's been talk that they could be handed an even lengthier points deduction, so maybe the 4 could become the 6. I thought it was a bit of a risky strategy from Forest.
Yeah, I agree with you on the risk for sure, because it could backfire.
So there's still something hanging over Everton.
Yes,
the potential of Forest picking up an extra couple of points for a frivolous appeal. Is that still a possibility, Dan?
I don't think it's impossible.
Right,
I think is the best way to look at it.
Yeah.
I still feel it's unlikely, but it's not impossible.
That relegation picture, as Pete said, you know, the bottom 3 are the 3 clubs that come up, and Luton are putting on a really great defence. I'm sure you'll be happy if Sheffield United are joining Sheffield Wednesday in the Championship, Dan. But let's talk about the Championship. We've mentioned it a couple of times, and let's talk about Leicester City, Dan. What's happened at Leicester City?
Yeah, so in a not too dissimilar way in terms of the numbers, they've just filed over the last few days as well. So their loss for 2022-23 was 89.7 million. That takes their 3-year loss to over 250 million.
But was that a Premier League year though?
Yes, this all relates to Premier League season.
That was a Premier League year. It's just this season they're in the Championship. Yeah, so that was
and we won't see those figures until another year down the line because of the way the filing works. So these are all Premier League seasons. But even if you look at that against the Premier League loss level on the bottom line, we're assuming there's a breach there. Their wages to turnover ratio for that year just gone that we're talking about, 22-23, was 116%. They spent £206 million on wages, which is the biggest outside of the big 6. And you know, again, the club have said themselves they finished fifth and 8th, I think, in the Premier League before they were relegated. So they've budgeted for, you know, top 10 Premier League budget, top half budget, and it's gone really wrong. The interesting thing with Leicester, of course, as we said, with where the regulations are at, is their argument is, you know, you should be, when can you touch us kind of thing in terms of against those regulations, because at the minute they're not a Premier League club. They're a Football League club. What happens if and when they potentially get promoted back? Is there going to be a points deduction applied at the start of next season if they're a Premier League club? If they're not a Premier League club, what does that look like? How does the EFL react? And that's when it gets even more tricky for me, because you've got essentially two different governing bodies with their own rules and regulations, but you've got clubs that move between those leagues. And Leicester are the example of that at the minute.
I saw the Rick Parry, Richard Masters in I always like, every now and again I watch one of those parliamentary sort of question. It's like a panel, isn't it? To sort of question them, and it's quite good entertainment. And there's no love lost between the Premier League and the Championship, is there? It's sort of this, they're sort of one's trying to get more money, the other one's trying not to. It's a very uneasy relationship, isn't it? And the clubs are sort of caught a little bit in the crossfire, don't you think, Pete? Or am I missing the point somewhat?
I think that obviously there was that recent vote to see if money would be filtering down from the Premier League to the EFL, and nothing could be agreed. I think 10 clubs voted against it, and some big clubs at that as well, who are obviously very rich and well financed, and they're not willing to give any money down to the EFL. And short memories, a lot of these clubs, because you've got to remember some of the players that are playing in these teams right now have come from the EFL, and that is the lifeblood of English football. It is the tiered system that we've got, and to really see EFL clubs struggling financially is really hard to see. And I think the Premier League is awash with money. I think it should be best served by helping out those clubs in the EFL, because the football pyramid is so much admired around Europe, the English football pyramid, and we really wouldn't want to see that be damaged even more. So I think some of the money and the riches that are on offer in the Premier League definitely need to be filtered down. And even then, sometimes EFL clubs miss out during transfer windows if money doesn't trickle down or filter down as well. Yeah. If Premier League clubs are going shopping abroad and everything else, and we saw how quiet the January transfer window was as well. So it's going to be some interesting figures, I think, when clubs do publish do their accounts on June 30th. There's going to be a lot of clubs, I think, really living in fear of PSR, FFP breaches heading into next season, and the fear of points deductions as well, which we've seen with Everton and Forest, and inevitably Leicester. For me, I would have major concerns for Leicester. I don't know what your feeling is, Dan. If they don't win promotion this season, it could be a real catastrophe for the club.
I think, irrespective of points deduction or charges, I think the finances suggest exactly that, Pete. It's they're in a hole at the minute financially. It'll take them a while to get out of that. Premier League football would be some way to getting out of that, but yeah, the losses are, as I say, 250 million over 3 years. It's a long way to claw that back, even with a generous owner. And again, there's plenty of clubs that don't have that, and I think that's where some of the things there, just to touch upon what you just said, are absolutely relevant and pertinent. I guess the other side of the coin that we just need to consider with that as well, and look at maybe what happens next, is two things. One is, if there is going to be more money that ever comes down from the Premier League to the Football League, that it's not just money that we just give to the clubs. It's with proper cost control measurements, and so it's not just a case of, we're going to give you X amount of million, and that then inevitably probably gets swallowed up in player wages and transfer fees. I think there's some work to be done still in that space that we've not quite bottomed out. And with a nod to where UEFA are now setting the sights on that, and we talked about the very start of the call on where this all came from, they've now moved away from financial fair play. We've got financial sustainability regulations now that have been agreed. They were agreed in the summer of 2022. So UEFA have moved away from FFP, and there are acceptable losses that are allowed within the new framework. But what is now being pinned on is this squad cost ratio, which essentially takes into account not just wages against your turnover, but transfer spend or net transfer spend, agents fees, managerial fees, and then it's kind of a catch-all for the kind of football operations side of the cost side of the business. And what UEFA want that figure to be is at 70% of turnover by 25-26. So clubs that compete there are working towards it. And just recently, we saw the Premier League kind of play their hand a little bit on this one and move to a meeting to the clubs to say, after the TV deal kind of collapsed, actually, or the new deal was being thrashed out, they changed tack pretty quick then to say, well, we're going to look to change the financial regulations, maybe even as soon as this summer. And the noises are that they're going to move in line with UEFA's regulations. So I think that's coming on the horizon, which is really interesting then in the case of Everton, Forest. Leicester is a big question mark, because if the Premier League changed the financial regs as early as the summer, where does that leave Leicester?
Yeah.
And they said they would sort the charges against Everton and Forest, and we know, of course, there's Manchester City on the horizon, but on a much bigger scale. but they've not said anything else about what happens next with some of the other clubs. So I think also what we're not talking about enough here is what those regulations potentially look like, maybe even as soon as the summer. And then some clubs will win and lose in that regard, because we might be looking at a different set of regs in a few months' time.
Yeah. But don't you think the PSR, the number, which we talked about at the start of the session, was 105? And I just said, oh, that's 1 or 2 players for a Premier League club. Don't you think that needed to shift anyway? But I take your point about...
I do, yeah, I agree.
You agree it needed to shift. But then, and UEFA have been, this thing about more competition, more matches, they've sucked more teams into their competitions as well. So, and I'm not just talking about the Premier League here, other leagues around the world are getting much more access to UEFA competitions, which you would think is a good thing. But if they're calling the shots on what you can spend for UEFA, they're almost calling the shots on what happens in the Premier League and what happens in the SPL and wherever else.
Well, I mean, the reality of that, and Pete's kind of alluded to it, maybe not explicitly as we've called it out, but what is happening is, and I've done plenty of research on, competitive balance in European football, and what is also clear is some of this unintended consequence of regulation is that in regulating, there will always be winners and losers. And what these regulations have done, not necessarily through design and purpose, but as collateral, is they've cemented a hierarchy in European football, and the biggest clubs will always be better suited to conform with those regulations. And even UEFA's changing regulations is no different. And if the Premier League do follow suit, then we're likely to see a similar outcome, because if you set that wages to turnover figure and the squad cost ratio at 70%, even if we look at wages to turnover figures, Spurs have just posted this morning, I think their wages turnover ratio is 46%. So they've got plenty of flex against UEFA's regs.
And that new stadium must be paying dividends as well.
So I've labelled it as an unintended consequence. We have to be aware of that as well, and I think that's kind of, I said I wasn't going to mention Sheffield Wednesday too much, but that's the downside for fans of clubs that aren't in that elite, because the reality is, you might be able to get into the Premier League, and you alluded to, Burnley, Sheffield United. What a story at Luton Town. It's possible, but
fantastic.
What's the reality after that is you're really up against it, and at some point you'll be back in the Football League. And I think that is a shame, but I don't see any silver bullet solution to that changes it for a long time.
Pete, I'm going to come to you first, but and then on to you, Dan. But is there any other clubs in this potential? 2 questions really. Any other clubs that are close to the wire that we haven't mentioned? I heard Darren Eales talk about not doing any business in January because it was financial PSR rules. And then secondly, what's the summer transfer window going to look like? We had a really quiet January. And is it going to be quiet in the Premier League, Championship, and other leagues? For you, Pete, first.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I think Newcastle are a team that were on the fringes of FFP. There's been lots of suggestions that they might have to sell some of their best players, the likes of Bruno Guimaraes, Alexander Isak, all being linked with moves away from Newcastle. So I think Newcastle looking like they're going to miss out in qualifying for the Champions League this season after their success last year. That's going to hurt them in the pocket, and I do think they're going to have to cut their cloth accordingly this summer. So I wouldn't be surprised if Bruno Guimaraes is sold. He's got that 100 million release clause in his contract as well, and there will be clubs at home and abroad ready to sign him. Wolves, I think, as well, have been on the fringes, and we've obviously seen that they've had to tighten their purse strings in the last couple of transfer windows as well. Forest, again, we know they've had the points deduction. They look like they might have to sell players before this June 30th deadline as well to help balance their accounts as well. So yeah, I think a lot of clubs are just living in fear right now of the PSR rules and possible points deductions and everything. But with that in mind, speaking to a lot of people and people in the game, they do expect the summer transfer window to be busy and a lot of money to be spent. So it's not going to affect the big clubs, it seems, in the Premier League and abroad. They are planning ahead for a busy summer transfer window. Obviously, again, we've got the Euros this summer as well. So that all mixes into the transfer window if some players come out of that tournament and have really good tournaments. That's going to put
Some
them
of
in
the
a strong.
Georgian guys, Pete. Some of the Georgian
There you
guys.
go. Some deals for you to get involved in there, Tony. If some of the Georgian boys do well, you can potentially move them to the Premier League. So I think for me, and speaking to a lot of people, I think the summer's going to be busy. Obviously, we did see a downturn in January on money being spent, even at the top end of the Premier League. But I think the summer transfer window is what most clubs see as the best window to do business in, and I do expect a lot of players coming in and a lot of players going out as well. So there will be a lot of trading, and clubs looking to balance their books by probably selling players as well.
Dan?
Yeah, I think the two go hand in hand, don't they? There, as Pete's alluded to, some of the clubs that are perhaps wary of their PSR calculation and might need to sell, then drives the transfer market activity. And there's Chelsea is another obvious example. Of course, we know their situation. Aston Villa on raw numbers were fairly close, we think, but there's a lot of the kind of clawbacks that you can get that we don't see. But based on some of those numbers, there are a few clubs, Newcastle, as Pete alluded to. And I guess then to flip that into the transfer market activity, I agree. I think that the summer windows are always busier than the winter windows. Yeah. History tells us that. A lot of clubs were very cautious in the January window, but you will look to see a lot more movement in the summer. And those kind of players that potentially clubs have to sell, maybe, to balance the books a little bit. When do those players become available otherwise? And actually, there's some opportunism to be had here in the market where you can get that player because you know that the selling club is under a little bit of pressure. And look at some of the potential players that are of real value in the future at some of those clubs. People talking a lot about Jared Branthwaite at the minute at Everton. That would be an obvious one that is a potential outgoing there, and somebody stands to benefit from that. So there are players out there that will, have a good value, and other clubs will buy them. And I guess that'll drive the summer transfer market. And actually, in doing that, you can weaken some of the competition as well. If you've got the money to spend and you can do it, then you are, in many ways, you are making a rival weaker by taking their players as well. So yeah, I agree with Pete. I think there will be some movement in the summer. Most of that movement will be in the Premier League and some of the biggest clubs, but we will still see it because of all the other factors that we're talking about.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes left here, and we've got one question from one of the guys in the audience. But from my point of view, I think Steve Parish, I listened to Steve Parish at Crystal Palace on a podcast webinar thing, and he was sort of saying these sort of new rules are cementing the position of the top, the elite. So that it's sort of like locking it in their competitive advantage because of the high income that they've achieved over the years. You mentioned the Tottenhams, the Man Uniteds, massive crowds, massive commercial, worldwide brands. And it's sort of, the others are trying to pick up scraps, maybe get into Europe, maybe. Is that the case with these rules? Is that another unintended consequence of these rules?
I personally, yes. And all the evidence and the data that I've been involved in collecting and publishing would allude to that exact point. It's increasingly difficult to close that gap. And we've talked about clubs again on the call that have tried to do it or have had a good couple of seasons and have not been able to repeat the trick. Newcastle, as Pete was saying, is a good example. Phenomenal season back into the Champions League, struggling to repeat the trick. Aston Villa would be another example this season. Phenomenal season, might get Champions League football, which would be incredible. Can you repeat that trick? And the data tells us that it's difficult to do that. The kind of hierarchy, as you said, is the top six are still holding, the big six are still holding the majority of that power, and they're the ones then that will more regularly qualify for the Champions League, which can be anything from 50 to 100 million pounds for a Premier League club, depending on how far they go. And they're already ahead of their rivals before a ball's been kicked. And I think that's the reality of it. Whether we, it's not the reality we perhaps want, but that is the reality of it at the minute.
Yeah, Pete, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we're always going to have that gap between the clubs. If these new UEFA financial regulations come in, just look at it like this. Nottingham Forest, 70% of maybe say their overall revenue of 200 million compared to 70% of Manchester United's revenue, which is maybe 600 plus million. You can't close that gap. The big clubs will keep continuing to be able to spend the money, sign the best players, offer the biggest wages. Forest have been victims of being their own ambitious, really, since coming into the Premier League. I think they've gone about it the wrong way in some places, but you can't knock the ambition of the owner, Makronakis. He's obviously put his hand in his pocket and gone out and signed all these players, and they achieved their aim last season, which was to stay in the Premier League.
Yeah.
And he wanted to build on that and make Forest an established force in the Premier League. And that's why they spent heavily again in the last couple of transfer windows. But obviously they find themselves with the points deduction. They're battling to stay up as well. So there'll be major issues for Forest next season if they do end up getting relegated as well, because they've got a lot of players on big wages there. And I'm not sure a lot of them are on relegation clauses as well. So you got to take everything into effect. But I think we're almost in our unofficial Super League as it is. The big clubs have got it locked down, and that's the way it's going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Just very briefly, I'm just going to throw this in. I've just thought about it, and actually, we saw Brighton's results, Dan, didn't we? Two of my favourite clubs. I've always followed Brentford, and this is not just since they got into the Premier League, but I've always loved their business model from when they started in League One, and the data and the analytics and the real attention to detail that those guys down at Brentford have. Brighton and Brentford, their models are fantastic for me. And you know, is it a case of you 6 or 7 compete for the prizes and we'll sell you the players to enable you? Do you know what I mean?
I doubt they'd ever come out and say that on record, but I think there's a degree of, again, there's examples and opportunities that present themselves, and I think obviously, you know, Brighton's financial figures, as you say, the record profit in the Premier League, £122 million profit, is a phenomenal achievement based on some of the numbers that we're looking at, and of course, you know, they might not have been an example for a club to pay that kind of money for some of the players that they sold, and this set of accounts doesn't even include the Caicedo deal. But you know, somebody buying Caicedo for 150 million perhaps doesn't happen in another world at another time. But notwithstanding that, I think the two things as well on there, on Brighton and Brentford, both have been able to find opportunities in the market and have done really well in that. The other interesting thing about the Brighton accounts is that they've been able to pay some of the money back to Tony Bloom for the first time in a long time, and the debt level to him is something in the region of 350 million still. So he's had to invest to put that club where it is. So you still need the backing, even with the strategy that they've been on. They've still needed that wealthy benefactor behind them, as a lot of clubs do. And the Brentford example, again, is a phenomenal model, and the growth that they've seen incrementally. But 3 seasons before they were promoted to the Premier League, their wages to turnover ratio was over 150%. And as Pete was saying earlier, you almost can't not do that to even land a chance of getting there. And for some clubs, it works. And for other clubs, as Pete said, you make 1 or 2 bad decisions and it can go the other way. So they are 2 really good models, but you know, they have been backed by, they've got the ownership behind them to over the long term to have put the money in to start that journey. You
answered one of the comments brilliantly there, Dan, as if you'd even reached into the mind of the question. So that was perfect. Let's go to these. Look, we've just got a minute left. There's no overtime and penalties in this one. Would Citigroup be a sustainable business model financially versus the new regs? That's a whole new webinar, the Citigroup. Just a quick one.
Yeah, Dan. In a word, yes, because the City Football Group model transcends. It stretches across multiple clubs and multiple leagues. So I guess in regulatory terms, the Premier League would look at Manchester City Football Club, and so it's the difference between the clubs you've got in the network. So I wouldn't foresee any problems with City Football Group in a changing world of regulations. Of course, the next webinar on that is probably what's going to happen to them, which we'll know in October, November time. So,
well, we'll get you back on, Dan, for sure. And then Adam's got a question, and I'll give this one to Pete. It's a long question, Adam, so excuse me. I'm just going to read out the nuts and bolts. Could you argue that the PSR is promoting unsustainable behaviour from clubs? And he's talking about Forest potentially, you know, is it promoting unsustainable behaviour?
Well, yeah, a lot of clubs are putting themselves in trouble. The point that Adam was making about they obviously turned down offers for Brennan Johnson when they could have sold them before that June 30th deadline when they did their accounts, and that might have saved them from this FFP charge, but they held out for a higher transfer fee and then ended up selling them to Tottenham in the end for 47.5 million. But yeah, Forest were obviously punished for breaching those PSR regulations, which again, like Dan's mentioned previously, was due to the fact that one of those years or a couple of those years were from the championship. We've obviously got different levels and limitations that you can go to. But yeah, I feel a bit of sympathy for Forest because they've tried to be competitive. They've tried to spend money and it's got themselves into a bit of trouble because of that. So what's the point in winning promotion if you're not just going to try and compete at least? And I think we need these new regulations in as soon as possible because the 105 million over a rolling 3-year period just isn't sustainable at all for me, especially now when you're looking at transfer fees of players. 105 million wouldn't have bought you Casado last season, and would just get you Declan Rice as well if you look upon it like that. So yeah, obviously clubs, we all say the Premier League is the most competitive league in Europe, and that's the way we want it. But if with those limits on spending and everything, I don't think it is.
I think just one thing to tag on to that quickly, Tony, as well. It's something I've questioned actually a lot recently. And is there a philosophical question of, is it regulation that's the problem, or is it the actors in the system and how they behave against those regulations? Because the numbers are clear and an owner then has a choice, a board has a choice. Do we roll the dice on that number or do we not? And I think some of those things there that Pete's alluded to are spot on.
I think that's a beautiful way to end it. Is it the actors or is it the system? And that's, I think that's another discussion as well. Dan, listen, that has been fantastic. It's 45 minutes has gone like that. Have you got anything, if anyone wants to read further or know further, or is the courses or, on this subject matter, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think thanks both, by the way, as well. Really enjoyed that and great to be on. Really good work that you're doing with this webinar. I think if anybody wants to connect, I'm on X, keep calling it Twitter. It's not Twitter anymore. Feel free to get in touch. There's loads of kind of nice introductory textbooks in this space if people just want to kind of dip into it and look at the basics, or that there's some always up to the higher level stuff and really deep financial analysis. So yeah, feel free to reach out and happy to point people towards relevant resources.
And are you on LinkedIn as well? Is Dr. Dan Plumley on X, is it? And
yes, it is. Yeah,
as well.
Yes, I am.
Next time you get a book out, we'll have to have you back on so you can.
Well, I didn't want to mention the book, but there is.
I'll go and mention the book.
A year.
Mention the book.
No, so it's called The Economics and Finance of Professional Team Sport, and it's an introductory textbook. It's designed for the students that I teach. So is kind of in a more general look at the industry, and it's not an expensive textbook, so it's available if anybody would like to purchase a copy.
Fantastic. And we'll try and get one for the Football Transfer Forum, because we have a book exchange at the Football Transfer Forum, which is happening next month in the
let me know. I'll send you a copy, Tony.
Brilliant.
Give me a call and I'll send you a copy, no problem.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks, Pete. As always, right on the money. No, that's Dan, right on the money. Pete, right on the gossip. He gets the inside information, does Pete? And I've really enjoyed that. Thanks, guys, ever so much. And we'll see you next time on Football Transfer Forum Marketplace. It's the 1st of May, and we'll have an expert guest with us again to talk about something else that we haven't got planned yet, but I'm sure we will. All right, guys. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Dan.
Hey, guys.
Take care.
Thanks, both.